He laughed when I quit. Right there in front of the entire floor. I remember the sound of it clearly, that smug little exhale through his nose, like my absence was a joke, like my presence had never mattered. "You'll be crawling back once reality hits," he said. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I had already decided that I had wasted enough of my life building someone else's dream while being treated like a replaceable part. He didn't know what I had planned. He didn't know what was already set in motion. He just leaned back in his leather chair, smiled that crooked half-smile of his, and dismissed me like I was nothing. But that was the last day I ever let someone make me feel small. The last day I ever gave my talent away for free. I had worked at Valencia Systems for nearly 8 years. I was the strategist behind what they bragged about to their investors. I was the one who turned chaotic ideas into working models, the one who took their half-baked innovation goals and turned them into real projects and real revenue. You would think a CEO would value someone like that, mentor them, give them room to grow. Not this one. He liked control too much. He liked credit too much. And most of all, he liked the idea that everyone under him was afraid to leave. So every time someone tried to shine, he dimmed their light. Every time someone showed potential, he took their work and slapped his name on it. I was no exception. I just happened to last longer than most. The final straw was the annual review. I didn't ask for a raise. I didn't even ask for a promotion. All I asked for was acknowledgement of my contribution to the company's largest client acquisition. He stared across the table at me, clicked his pen, and said the words that ended everything: "We all contribute, but not everyone is built to lead." Then he stood up, shook my hand, and dismissed me from the room like I was done. He expected me to accept it. To swallow it. To stay quiet. Instead, I typed my resignation that night. No notice. No emotional explanation. Just 6 words, effective immediately. "Thank you for the opportunity." What he didn't know was that, for the past 6 months, I had been consulting privately. Quietly. Carefully. Legally. There was nothing in my contract restricting it. I knew how he treated people. I knew this day would come eventually. One of those clients happened to be a startup that had fire, vision, and hunger, everything Valencia Systems had lost. They were small when I met them. Scattered. Rough around the edges. But their idea was better than anything Valencia had touched in years. What they needed was guidance. Structure. A strategist who knew how the industry worked. Someone who had lived in the machine long enough to know how to beat it from the outside. For the next 3 months, I built with them. Not as an employee. As a partner. Then one day, we got the call. Tech World Expo. Main stage keynote. The industry event. Valencia Systems was presenting too. That was their pride event. Their spotlight. And the CEO, he always made sure he was front and center for it. Always basked in the applause. Always played the visionary. He had no idea I was coming. The morning of the expo felt electric. I remember seeing their booth first. Same banners. Same forced smiles. Same tired pitch. And there he was. Arrogant. Comfortable. Confident. Like the world was already his. He didn't see me. Not yet. That came later. When my team was announced on stage, the crowd was expecting something small, something forgettable. The room quieted when they saw me step up to the mic. And that's when I saw him. Standing near the front. His face went still. Eyes wide. The smirk slipped off like melting wax. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. I didn't say his name. I didn't have to. I presented our product, our strategy, our partnerships, our launch roadmap. The crowd didn't just clap, they roared. Investors swarmed us before we even left the stage. And him? He just stood there, silent, watching everything he underestimated walk right past him. By the end of that quarter, our startup had secured funding that tripled Valencia Systems' valuation. 2 of their biggest clients signed with us, and 3 of their best engineers followed. Not because I poached them. I didn't need to. People follow respect, not power. I never once mentioned him publicly. I never bragged. I never fought. I just built. And he had to live with knowing that the man he laughed at, the man he dismissed like nothing, had gone farther than he ever could. Revenge didn't come from proving him wrong. It came from proving myself right. People like him always expect the world to stay exactly as they left it. They expect everyone they stepped on to remain under their heel, frozen in place, waiting for validation that will never come. But the industry was changing. Conversations shifted. New voices were rising. And mine was one of them. I didn't seek attention, but attention knew where to find me now. I was invited to panels, interviews, think tanks. People wanted to understand how we moved so fast, how we broke into a market that had been locked down for decades. They were surprised when I answered honestly, we listened. We respected. We built with intention. There was no secret formula. Just dignity and hard work, something Valencia Systems had forgotten. I began seeing my former coworkers at conferences and professional events. Some avoided me, embarrassed by how they treated me back then. Others approached quietly, telling stories of how the CEO was pacing the halls now, more desperate, more controlling. The board was asking questions he didn't have answers to. Investors were pushing for growth he couldn't replicate. His confidence had cracked. And once someone like him cracks, the fall is fast and loud. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't need to. I remembered exactly who I used to be when I worked there, tired, overlooked, trying to prove myself to someone who never had the capacity to appreciate value in the first place. I couldn't hate him. I had outgrown him. Then one morning, I received a message from someone I hadn't expected, his assistant, the one who always looked exhausted, the one who silently fixed his mistakes, the one who was invisible in a room full of shouting voices. She asked if we were hiring. Not just for herself, but for a few others who couldn't take the environment anymore. She didn't beg. She didn't flatter. She simply said, "We want to do work we can be proud of again." I hired all of them. Not because I needed staff, we were doing fine. But because I knew what it felt like to lose yourself in a place that refuses to see you. Months later, I saw him again. Not on a stage. Not in a boardroom. He was sitting alone at a small trade booth at a minor industry fair, the kind of event he used to mock for being irrelevant. He looked smaller. Not physically. Just diminished. The kind of shrinking that happens when a person's power leaves before they do. He saw me. And there was no anger in his face. No arrogance. Just recognition, the quiet, heavy kind that weighs in the chest. He nodded. I nodded back. No words. No victory lap. No speech. Because the truth is, the revenge had already happened a long time ago. It happened the moment I stopped trying to earn his approval. It happened when I chose to build something of my own. It happened when I walked away. The real win wasn't standing on stage. It wasn't the funding. It wasn't the applause. The real win was this: I became someone I could be proud of. And he became a reminder of who I will never be again. Life settled into something calm after that. Not easy, not effortless, but calm in the way a person feels when they are finally moving in the direction they were always meant to go. I woke up each morning not to stress or obligation, but to purpose. I worked with people who challenged me, who questioned me, who improved the work rather than settling for good enough. Our office didn't look like success to outsiders. No glass walls. No marble lobby. Just a converted warehouse with big windows, scribbled whiteboards, late-night coffee cups, and the sound of ideas being built in real time. And yet, it felt more like home than any corporate tower ever had. I would watch my team sometimes, arguing, laughing, focused, frustrated, inspired, and I realized something I had never admitted. All I ever wanted was to be part of something real. Not something impressive, not something prestigious. Just something true. I heard through the industry that Valencia Systems was restructuring. Then downsizing. Then rebranding. Each headline was smaller than the last, quieter than the last, fading instead of falling. He stayed on as CEO for a while, clinging to the title like a lifeline. But a title means nothing when there's no belief behind it. Eventually, the board quietly removed him. No scandal. No press release. Just a footnote in a quarterly filing. They replaced him with someone younger, someone more open, someone who understood collaboration instead of control. The company still exists, technically. But the soul of it, the part that once dreamed, was gone long before I left. One rainy evening, years later, I saw him again. Not in business. Just life. He was sitting on a park bench, watching the streetlights shimmer across puddles. He looked tired, but calmer than I remembered. Not defeated, just human. I walked past him, and for a moment, we made eye contact. No bitterness. No tension. Just two people who had once shared a chapter of life that shaped them in different ways. He didn't speak. I didn't either. We didn't need to. Some stories don't end with apologies or confrontations. Some endings are just acknowledgments, a quiet understanding that both of us had to break to become who we were meant to be. I kept walking, hands in my coat pockets, listening to the sound of the rain. And I felt something I never expected to feel. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just peace. Because I finally understood, the real revenge was never the success, the applause, the stage, or the funding. The real revenge was that I learned how to respect myself again. I stopped fighting to be seen. And I started living in a world where I already was. As I walked home through the rain, I thought about how strange life can be. How the places we think will define us are often just stepping stones. How the people who try to limit us end up teaching us how far we're capable of going. I used to believe that my value came from how useful I was to someone else, how much profit I generated, how many problems I could solve, how quietly I could endure disrespect. I don't blame the younger version of me for believing that. He was trying to survive in a world that rewarded silence more than integrity. But surviving is not the same thing as living, and I didn't truly understand that until I finally walked away. Years passed like that, steady, fulfilling, honest. Our company grew slowly, but intentionally. We didn't chase trends or headlines. We didn't burn out chasing impossible timelines. We built systems meant to last, and we taught others how to do the same. I spent less time in boardrooms and more time mentoring. I saw young developers who reminded me of younger me, brilliant, soft-spoken, underestimated, learning how to trust their own voice. They didn't need to fight for visibility. They already had it. I made sure of that. One evening, after finishing a meeting, one of our newest hires stopped me. He was nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Eventually, he said, "I just wanted to thank you for making a place where people like us don't disappear." His voice cracked on the last word. I didn't know his full story. I didn't need to. I just nodded, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "You were never meant to disappear. You just needed space to exist." He smiled, and in that moment, I realized something quietly profound: the cycle had broken. No one here would lose themselves the way I once did. One day, I received an invitation to speak at a leadership symposium. The introduction they wrote for me was long, filled with accomplishments and awards, but the line that stayed with me was short: known for building organizations where people feel seen. Not strategic innovator. Not industry disruptor. Not visionary. Just someone who creates space for people to be themselves. That, more than any title, felt like success. Standing backstage before my talk, I thought about him again. The CEO who had once smirked at my resignation. Not with anger. Not with nostalgia. Just with understanding. He and I had both shaped each other's paths, just not in the way he intended. He taught me who I refused to become. And I taught myself who I wanted to be. I stepped onto the stage, lights warm on my face, room full of people listening not because they wanted to be impressed, but because they wanted to learn. I began speaking, not with grandeur or rehearsed lines, but with quiet honesty. The most important career decision you will ever make is this: choose to work where your presence matters. The audience leaned in. And I knew, in that moment, that I had finally become the person I needed when I was younger. That was the real ending. Not revenge. Not spectacle. Just a man who found his voice. And used it to help others find theirs too. A few years later, that building, the one they had once ruled, became a landmark in the city's innovation district. Reporters began referring to it as the Phoenix Tower, a name coined by one of our interns who said it rose from corporate ashes. The nickname stuck. Every time I passed by the engraved sign at the entrance, I couldn't help but grin. The same doors I once walked out of in humiliation were now the entrance to something that inspired hundreds of people daily. What made it even more poetic was what occupied the old CEO's former office. It was now a glass-walled creative hub filled with young developers, artists, and designers brainstorming together over pizza boxes and late-night playlists. They'd covered one of the walls with sticky notes filled with ideas, quotes, and doodles, and right in the center of it, someone had written in bold marker, "Never let them decide your worth." Nobody knew who wrote it, but everyone left it untouched. It had become a kind of unspoken motto. I started spending less time managing and more time mentoring. One of my favorite parts of the day became walking through the floors, asking questions, listening, and watching people grow in ways they never thought possible. Many of them had stories similar to mine: fired unfairly, overlooked, underestimated. Here, though, they weren't survivors. They were builders. Architects of their own redemption. One afternoon, a journalist came by to do a feature on Reclaim. She asked a question I'd been asked 100 times before: "Do you think you got revenge?" I laughed quietly and said, "If you asked me years ago, maybe. But now? I think I got something better." She tilted her head, curious, and I continued, "Revenge ends when they lose. Redemption begins when you win without them." That line ended up as the headline of her article. It went viral overnight, not because of the company's success, but because of what it represented: a story of quiet power, patience, and poetic balance. People don't forget that kind of story. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a global entrepreneurship summit. As I stepped onto the stage, looking out at a sea of faces, I realized something profound. The man who once sat behind a desk, trembling as he handed in his termination papers, had become someone others came to for strength. I told them my story, from betrayal to ownership, not to boast but to remind them that even in the darkest chapters, there's a way to rewrite the ending, if you have the courage to keep your pen moving. When the applause faded and I walked off stage, I received a text from one of my first ever employees at Reclaim. "Boss, the lights are still on at the office. The new team's staying late again. They said they don't want to go home yet, they're having too much fun building." I stood there for a moment, smiling at my phone, the noise of the crowd fading behind me. That message, not the success, not the headlines, was the real reward. Because in the end, the greatest revenge wasn't in evicting them or proving them wrong. It was in creating something so right that it outshone every wrong they ever did. And as I looked out at the skyline that night, the same one that had once made me feel small, I realized something. They had fired me, yes. But they had also freed me. And from that freedom, I built something eternal, not just a company, but a legacy carved from resilience. A reminder to anyone who's ever been discarded, sometimes the best way to get even is to rise higher than they ever dreamed you could. Years passed, and Reclaim grew far beyond anything I had ever imagined. What began as a small startup born from betrayal had transformed into a global force, one that operated with principles the corporate world had long forgotten: integrity, empathy, and shared success. We didn't just create products, we created opportunity. Every new branch, every project, carried the same DNA, built by those who were once told they weren't good enough. One crisp winter morning, I found myself standing outside the building, watching as a group of young professionals entered with enthusiasm that reminded me of my early days. Across the street, I noticed a familiar figure, older now, shoulders slightly slouched but unmistakably her. The former CEO. She hesitated for a moment before walking over. We hadn't spoken since the day she smirked at my resignation all those years ago. "Quite the empire you've built," she said, her voice softer, the sharpness gone. I smiled faintly. "And quite the lesson you gave me to start it." She chuckled, a tired, knowing sound. "You were always meant to lead. I just didn't want to see it then." There was no bitterness in her tone. Just truth. Time has a way of humbling even the proudest of us. We stood there for a moment, the silence filled with memories of everything that had passed, the late nights, the betrayal, the years of rebuilding. "Do you ever think it was worth it?" she finally asked. I looked up at Reclaim's shining logo above the entrance, glowing against the morning sky. "Every second," I said. "Because I didn't just build a company. I built a place where people are never treated like I was." She nodded slowly, her eyes misting slightly, then turned and walked away. I watched her disappear into the city crowd, not with anger, but with understanding. Some stories don't need revenge to end, just closure. Back inside, my assistant handed me the latest quarterly report. Record profits. Record growth. But what made me proudest wasn't the numbers. It was the note stapled to the top, written by one of our new hires. It read, "Thank you for building a company that believes in people like me. I was fired from my last job for being too passionate. Here, that's my greatest strength." That one line summed up everything I had fought for. All the sleepless nights, the risks, the long road from humiliation to triumph, it all led to this. A legacy not of revenge, but redemption. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, I walked to the rooftop one last time. The city stretched endlessly before me, alive, restless, beautiful. I thought about how far I'd come, about the man who once walked away from this same building feeling worthless, and how that man had returned years later owning it, reshaping it, redefining it. And in that golden hour of fading light, I whispered something to myself, a truth I had earned through every scar and every victory. They fired me. But that was the best thing they ever did. Because sometimes, losing everything is what gives you the freedom to build something greater. And standing there, looking out at the horizon, I knew I had finally done it, not just gotten even, but moved beyond. The past was gone. The pain was gone. All that remained was peace, and the empire built from it. As the years went on, Reclaim became more than a company, it became a movement. We began mentoring other fired employees, displaced engineers, and founders who had been tossed aside by corporations that didn't value loyalty or creativity. I watched hundreds of people find purpose again through what we built together. It was humbling and surreal. The irony never faded. What began as my personal revenge story had transformed into a redemption network for thousands. We launched a foundation to fund startups founded by people over 40, the very demographic most companies ignored. We called it Second Horizon. Within 2 years, Second Horizon had helped launch over 120 companies worldwide, all run by people who had once been told they were past their prime. Some of them came back to our building, standing where I once stood, scared, bitter, lost, and told me that hearing my story had kept them going when they almost gave up. That was when I realized something profound. Revenge had burned away long ago, replaced by purpose. One evening, during a gala celebrating Reclaim's 20th anniversary, I stood backstage, waiting to give my speech. The crowd outside was massive: clients, partners, journalists, and hundreds of employees who had become like family. As the lights dimmed and the host called my name, I stepped out under the warm glow of the spotlight. For a moment, I froze, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. The applause, the energy, the sheer weight of it all reminded me of something simple: this had all started with loss. When the room finally quieted, I looked at them and said, I used to think revenge was the end of the story. That once I got even, I'd find peace. But standing here now, I see that revenge was just the spark. What truly mattered was what came after: the building, the people, the legacy. We didn't just rise again. We redefined what rising means. There was a long pause, then the crowd erupted in applause. But in the middle of all the noise, I noticed a small table near the back, a young man, probably in his late 20s, sitting alone. He looked how I used to look, determined, hurt, but hungry for a chance. After the event, he approached me and said, "They fired me last month. I saw your story online. You think I can really start over?" I smiled, handed him my card, and said, "Don't just start over. Start better. They gave you freedom disguised as failure. Use it." He grinned, eyes lighting up, and that look, pure belief, was the best reward I could ever receive. Months later, I got a message from him. His startup had landed its first investor. He signed off the email with, "Thank you for showing me that revenge doesn't have to be about destruction, it can be about creation." Reading that, I leaned back in my chair and looked out the same office window I had all those years ago, when everything had fallen apart. Only this time, the skyline didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like home. Because in the end, revenge was never really about getting even, it was about rebuilding yourself so completely that the version of you they broke no longer exists. And as the night lights of the city reflected across the glass, I whispered the same words I had once said to myself when I stood at rock bottom: they fired me. I evicted them. But more than that, I became everything they were too blind to see. And this time, the thought didn't sting. It just felt right, like the final line of a story that had come full circle. Years later, the story of Reclaim and its origins had become something of a legend in business circles. Documentaries were made, podcasts recounted the tale, and every now and then, a journalist would write a fresh piece about the man who evicted his old bosses and built an empire. I never sought that spotlight, but I couldn't deny that it kept inspiring people who'd been cast aside by the same kind of arrogance I'd once faced. By that time, I had stepped down as CEO, handing the reins to one of our earliest hires, a woman who had been an intern when we started. Watching her lead with grace and strength gave me more pride than any headline or award ever could. I stayed on the board, more as a mentor than a leader, and spent my days working on new ventures and writing about leadership, real leadership, the kind that values people as much as profits. One afternoon, I was invited to a university to give a talk on resilience. The auditorium was packed with students, bright faces, full of curiosity and ambition. After I told my story, a young woman raised her hand and asked, "If you could go back and stop them from firing you, would you?" The question lingered in the air for a moment. I smiled and said, "No." Because sometimes losing your job is how you find your purpose. They didn't end my career, they redirected it. The room went silent for a moment, and I could see that it landed. After the talk, as students came up to shake my hand, one of them said quietly, "My dad was laid off last year. I'm going to show him your story." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. That was when it hit me, the legacy wasn't the company, or the wealth, or even the poetic revenge. The legacy was the ripple effect. The countless people who'd see that you could lose everything and still come back stronger than ever. Later that evening, as I walked through the city, I passed the old corporate district where everything had once gone wrong. The building that had housed my former company was now a co-working space filled with young entrepreneurs. The irony made me smile. Time had a strange sense of humor. I paused outside the glass doors and looked inside. For a moment, I saw reflections of my younger self, tired, uncertain, but driven by something bigger than pride. I realized that my revenge story had long since transformed into something else entirely. It was no longer about payback. It was about progress. I took one last look, then turned toward Reclaim Tower, its name glowing softly in the distance. That light felt different now. Not like victory, but like peace. A peace earned through years of pain, growth, and rebuilding. As I stepped into my car, I thought about the people who had stood beside me through it all, the ones who stayed when everything fell apart, who believed when I doubted myself. I thought about the janitor who gave me a handshake the day I was fired and said, "Maybe this is a blessing, boss." Back then, I didn't believe him. Now, I knew he was right. Because what I learned, after all the revenge, redemption, and rebuilding, was this: every ending is just a chapter break. It's not the fall that defines you. It's the rebuild. And so, as the city lights blurred into the night, I whispered the words that had followed me since that first day of betrayal: they fired me. I evicted them. And in the end, I thanked them. Because without their arrogance, I would have never found my freedom. Without their cruelty, I would have never found my purpose. And sometimes, the greatest revenge of all is simply becoming the person they'll never stop remembering. And so, after decades of struggle, rebuilding, and redemption, my story came full circle. The fire that once burned for revenge had cooled into something far more powerful: clarity. What began as anger had become purpose. What began with loss had become legacy. Reclaim stood tall not because I wanted to prove them wrong, but because I learned how to build something right. I still walk those same halls sometimes, the polished floors echoing with laughter and ideas. The young faces I pass have no idea that these walls were once a battlefield. To them, this is just a place of opportunity, a space that believes in people. And that, more than anything, is what I always wanted. On the top floor, my old office has become a quiet lounge. The window looks out across the skyline, and from there, I can still see the old district, the ghosts of the past fading in the distance. I often stand there at dusk, watching the sunset pour gold over the city, and I think about how far things have come. How a single act of betrayal became the spark that built an empire of integrity. Every ending, I've learned, hides the blueprint of a beginning. When they fired me, they thought they were closing a chapter. But what they really did was hand me the pen. I rewrote the story, not out of spite, but out of strength. Now, when people ask if I ever got my revenge, I just smile. Because true revenge isn't about destroying them, it's about outlasting them, outgrowing them, and creating something they could never imagine. They fired me. I evicted them. And in doing so, I built a legacy that will stand long after their names are forgotten. That, in the end, is the perfect revenge, living in peace, standing in purpose, and knowing that you turned their dismissal into your destiny.